Welcome, everyone. Yeah, I'm Christian from EMBL Heidelberg, and it's my great pleasure to introduce my sort of colleague from EMBL-EBI, Virginie. And so about her CV, so she's Swiss, born in the French part of Switzerland, I guess. Then she did her undergraduate at the EPFL in Lausanne. Then she ticked a lot of boxes when it comes to making a career in image analysis. Namely, she visited Ann Carpenter for a year. Then she visited Fred Hamprecht for a year, who is sort of famous for Elastic was founded there. Then she went to Michael Unser, who I think is also relatively well known, again at the EPFL in Lausanne. And then she became a group leader at EMBL-EBI, working on morphology and image analysis, as far as I'm concerned. And in terms of her hobbies, she likes climbing, but I think maybe it was a bit difficult now with all the corona, but hope that's getting better. And I just learned that she also has a parrot now that may contribute to the talk at some point. Let's see. Okay, Virginie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tishi. Yeah, regarding the climbing, it's not just the coronavirus that doesn't help, but also the UK landscape. I'm gonna try and attempt screen sharing now. Can you confirm that you see the slide in presentation mode?
Yes, I can confirm.
Okay, excellent. Good. Yeah, so thank you again, Tishi, for the introduction. And thanks to all of you being here. In spite of the many rescheduling events, I had to postpone the talk on the initial date because of side effect from the coronavirus vaccine. So I'm very happy to now be back on my feet to tell you about my group's effort in quantifying biological shape across imaging modalities. And I also want to thank Ulrike and the other organizers of this seminar series. It's really my great pleasure to be invited to give this talk today. So my group is interested in the problem of quantifying shape or morphology from microscopy images. And we are not interested in just one type of microscopy image, but really like all the microscopy images that there is. And what I mean by that is that we typically don't want to be restricted to a specific modality. And the underlying reason, and I'm pretty sure I don't need to convince you all of this, is that shape or morphology actually plays a role pretty much at all scales of living systems. So any type of bioimage somehow contains morphological information. Whether we look at what's happening inside a cell, at the cellular level, at the tissue level, at the organism level, even swarms of organisms, actually, there is always something that relates to shape because it is influenced by function and influences function as well. So what I want to illustrate on this slide are examples from different projects that we were or we are involved in, and I really just want to illustrate the diversity of what this concept of shape can take visually. So this is obviously a purely visual feature, and as such, sometimes it's 2D, sometimes it's 3D, sometimes it contains colors. I don't know. We see it in the context of many investigation of many different types of biological problem, but really what we are interested in is trying to think of this problem in a kind of abstract way and wonder, okay, if I take all of this example, sorry, can I find a framework in which these will be particular cases of a more general setting? Can I somehow treat all of these examples as something similar through the same lens? So to approach that, let's first have a look at what we need to do if we want to quantify shape from images. And this generally really is a two-step process. So the first thing obviously is to figure out where are the objects, which morphology we want to characterize in the image. So that is segmentation. And I'm sure that all of you have encountered that at some point in your life if you've ever played with image analysis. So it is a hard problem, but it has attracted a lot of attention. Therefore, there are good tools to solve that. And some of them that we know very well at EMBL and at Janilia, I guess. So I would not personally say that it's a solved problem. I think there may be disagreement on that, but I think we are getting very, very good tools to do the segmentation step, and we'll probably get even better tools in the future, but it's still a hard bit. In any case, what we get out of a segmentation algorithm is a description of the different objects that we have in our image as a collection of pixel coordinates in the image grid. So that's our object representation. And from this object representation, we can describe each object with a feature vector that characterizes its morphology. So that's a vector of numbers that can range all the way from simple handcrafted metrics, like, I don't know, the size of the object, for instance, just the amount of pixel it contains, or its curvature, its perimeter, this sort of things, to maybe more complex and less interpretable representation, for instance, obtained with machine learning. Sorry. And just to say, I'm sorry, I may sneeze or cough from time to time just because there's a lot of pollen around in the UK at the moment. And my allergies are not making my life easy. So I hope this won't disrupt us too much. But in any case, that is the process. And what we have to keep in mind through that is that the sort of numbers we extract to build the morphology descriptor actually depend on the representation we started from. And what I mean by this is that obviously the number of pixels we had at our disposal in the first place, or their size, so that would be the resolution essentially of the sensor we used to do the image acquisition, will play a role and will influence the sort of numbers that we get. So this has very concrete implications. The first one is essentially that if we were to take the same biological sample and image it under different microscopes, then we would get different descriptors that characterize its morphology. And somehow the difference in these descriptors would be a mixture between, okay, the different biological features that we see with these different systems, but also just the different nature of the systems themselves. So, you know, like the different sizes of the sensor that were used, the different pixel grids, and so on and so forth. So it is not necessarily impossible to deconvolve these aspects, but it seems that somehow this process doesn't really make our life easy if what we want is to be able to aggregate information coming from different images and really deal with image data as a unifying data format that does not depend on the image modality. So what we are doing with my group is to take a slightly different approach and essentially exploit the use of object representation that are called geometrical models. So you will hear a lot about them during the talk. Essentially, these are mathematical descriptions of an object that would be a contour or a surface or a manifold. We'll talk about that again later on. And they have two important properties. The first one is that they are continuously defined. So there is no notion of grid anymore. We can like zoom infinitely on them. These are actually vector graphics objects. And they explicitly describe the geometry of the object. And what this means concretely is that characterizing or quantifying the morphology basically boils down to characterizing the properties of the geometrical model we extracted. So the process of relying on this sort of representation, geometrical modeling, is definitely not something I invented. That is at the core of computer graphics and of vector graphics in particular. So you probably actually have interacted already with this kind of object if you've ever done vector graphics through Illustrator or Keynote. That's exactly this kind of representation. Concretely, these structures are built, for instance, with spline interpolation or subdivision scheme or meshes and so on and so forth. And they have been actually also extensively used in medical imaging, specifically for shape characterization. So we have very, very good reasons to believe that this is the right place to go. However, as you shall see, it is not completely straightforward to build this sort of structure. And in the context of medical imaging, it has benefited a lot from the fact that that data are very standardized, which is obviously not the case in microscopy. So the reason why we are interested in that, and really the beauty of geometrical modeling, is that it gives us exactly this thing that I was talking about in my first slide, which is step of abstraction that allows us to see this problem of quantifying morphology in a very, very general manner. And what I mean by general is essentially that all the different problems that you saw on my first slide, so these different images where we're trying to quantify a difference of shapes between population, between one object that deforms over time, between different embryos, and so on and so forth, they can all be seen through the geometrical modeling lens as variation on the theme of I have different geometrical models. I know their mathematical expression. I just want to characterize how much they differ. And this can be done with classical tools from differential geometry or literally just algebra by using inner products and correlations and so on and so forth. So this really gives us somehow a very unifying way to approach this problem by taking a step away from the actual image data. So that's kind of the overarching goal that we want to get to, but obviously it's a long story and we are at the beginning. So in this talk, I want to tell you about two of our recent work along two axes. The first one is geometrical modeling itself, and the second one is shape analysis. So let's first have a look at geometrical modeling, and that really is the process of extracting this representation from images. So if we have as input image data, how do we get this sort of vectographic continuous well-defined representation based on the image data out of the image? So to understand how we build this structure, probably because I spent a lot of time with people doing signal processing, I like to explain that first in 1D. So let's just think of the 1D problem, and then the 2D problem is going to be very similar. So what we have essentially is a situation in which we have access to a set of discrete samples. So that would be these points here. And we know that they are drawn from a continuous process. So we know that they are drawn from something that doesn't have holes in between. How do we reconstruct a continuous approximation from these points? Well, I mean, I guess you pretty much all have faced that at some point in your life. If you've worked with data analysis, you can use interpolation for that. So what you will do is pick a basis function or a set of basis function and interpolate a continuous model between these points. Now, you can actually, with the same framework, just decide, oh, actually, I'm not necessarily happy with this solution that is just a linear interpolation between my data point. I may want something that is smoother. So you can just change your mind and change the basis function for something smoother, maybe the cubic spline. Okay, this is just a drawing, so it's nowhere near cubic, but something smoother. And essentially, the nice thing about this framework is that it gives you a lot of freedom in what you reconstruct, but somehow the way that things are built is always the same. So the red curve that you get here, or the one that I was showing before, that would be piecewise linear, is going to be expressed as some weighted sum of some parameters that will be a function of your samples, may not be the sample themselves, maybe a function of them, and the basis functions, which tells you how you interpolate between the points. So that is for 1D. Now, actually, why did I explain you that in 1D? Because the problem we have in image processing is actually very similar. What we have now is our collection of pixels or voxels, that is the segmentation, the image coordinate of the contour of the object. And what we want to do is to reconstruct a continuous approximation of the object contour surface. And I think, I mean, we all agree that no cell was ever made of pixels. So you know, this is a reasonable assumption to say that these pixels or these voxels are the equivalent to our discrete samples. And what we want to do is to get this kind of continuous approximation of it. So if we want to do that, there are two things we have to figure out. The first one is what are the basis functions we use? And the second one is what are the parameters of our model? And these two questions are actually not really independent of each other. Just to give you a hint of that, if that's the object, or let's say that's the set of pixels that I have at my disposal that I want to use in order to build my model, actually I could build these two models that equally fit this data. Now, you know, which one is best? Well, I guess it depends on the prior information you have and maybe what you want to investigate. So here, this would be one that has a lot of parameter and somehow linearly interpolates in between. This one would be less parameter and the smoother interpolation. Again, what do you prefer? Like personally, I would prefer this one because it has a taste of minimal model. So kind of, you know, what is the minimal amount of parameter we need in order to faithfully approximate this shape? But maybe we know something about how the cell is constructed that makes this model more reliable, or let's say more appropriate. This is yeah, this is left to the particular problem that we are considering. So let's first have a look at the problem of picking up which basis function we're going to use, and this is not straightforward. So there is actually quite a lot of research that goes into coming up with different interpolation scheme and approximation schemes that have interesting properties. And this is actually what I was doing before joining EMBL. So again, if you think of the problem that you would have in computer graphics, where you have man-made object or manually designed object, then we can we can have this kind of ideal case in which the object we want to approximate has, I don't know, pure linear counterparts or pure polynomial components. This is obviously not going to happen in reality, because what we have here are real cells, so real objects in bioimages. Sorry. And these may not be composed of purely polynomial or pure linear parts. So in reality, as you may have experienced already, if you've ever done data analysis again in 1D, generally it's like either you're happy with something that is linear and you take a linear interpolator, or you want something smooth and you take the cubic B-spline. So this kind of also works here in practice. But you can also do things that are a bit more advanced. And typically this last interpolator that you see here is something that was designed specifically for bioimage analysis. So this is an interpolator that reproduces spheres and ellipses. So this is actually what would be most appropriate if you are in a setting where, I don't know, for instance, you have objects in liquid and you know that because of surface tension, they will tend to become purely spherical or purely elliptical. Now you can also go more advanced and again maybe say, okay, we know that in reality we're not going to have objects that are purely this particular geometrical property or that particular geometrical property, so we want models that have more freedom, and this is also something that we have explored. So this type of model, for instance, would be actually the equivalent of Bezier curves that are used in computer graphics. So this is something that allows you to have different types of geometrical properties locally on your model. This one is based on subdivision curves. So that would be essentially allowing you to locally refine the model based on the local complexity of the object. So if you had, I don't know, a cell that differentiates and that becomes more complex over time, then this is the sort of thing you may want to use. Then you may notice that I'm only talking of 2D here. This can be extended to more dimensions. So we can also build basis function that allow us to reconstruct surfaces in 3D or manifolds in 4D. Again, this is not something that is entirely straightforward. There is active research on that. Actually, there is one paper from my previous collaborator, Anaïs, that just got out, I think, 2 days ago on another scheme for 3D surfaces for bioimages. So as much as I would want to have a solution here to tell you, you don't need to know anything about approximation. All you need is one image. You throw it into this black box. It will throw out the basis function you need to use. We are not there yet. We're working very hard on it. And I hope that, I can give this talk in a few years and have a solution for that. But this is not something that we have at the moment. At the moment, there is quite a lot of expertise that goes into that. Now, there is a simpler problem, and it is that of saying, okay, what if we fix the basis function? So what if we know that, for instance, okay, we have smooth objects, so we are going to use cubic B-spline, for instance, and all we want is to figure out the parameters of the model. This is a much simpler problem, and this is one that we have explored, and this is the work of my student Soham that I'm going to present here. Essentially, what we wanted to have is a tool that allows us to say, okay, here is one image, possibly with many objects. I'm going to throw that into an algorithm that is going to spit out for a given type of model the parameters of the model for each of the objects in the image. And I can then change my mind and say, exactly as I did in my 2D toy example before, I'm actually not happy with this linear model. Now I want something smoother. Well, the same algorithm can return now the parameters for a smoother model for these images. For these objects. So the way we have done that is by adapting a method called Stardust that I'm sure pretty much every of you know. This is a supervised object detection segmentation technique that was developed by Uwe Schmidt and Martin Weigert. And essentially the way that Stardust works is taking input images with possibly many objects, possibly very crowded, use a unit model to predict an instant segmentation mask of this image. So this is a segmentation algorithm. And again, what we're trying to do is not segmentation, actually, it's geometrical modeling. But the reason why we got interested in this method is that it actually uses a specific object model to predict this segmentation mask that is based on ray tracing. So the way that Stardust works is to have a set of ground truth object probabilities. So basically just saying, okay, for each pixel, whether it belongs to an object or not, and also a set of ground truth rays. So that would be essentially a description of the object obtained by from a pixel inside the object, tracing rays at fixed angles and looking at their length until then they reach the contour. So again, if you think of how we build geometrical models, this kind of sound like something similar. And in fact, we can show that this is a very particular restricted case of a geometrical model. So that would be kind of one where the parameters are at fixed angle and where we linearly interpolate in between. So it's not really what we want, but in the spirit, it's somehow close. So we thought, okay, can we adapt this technique to actually predict parameters of more flexible, like classical geometrical model types? And for this, the first thing we need to figure out is how do we train this model? So what is it actually that we have access to, and what is it that we want to predict? And in our case, there is no, I mean, we don't have necessarily ground truth geometrical models, right? And I'm going to elaborate on that in a second. What we have for sure is a discrete ground truth contour. So we definitely have a ground truth segmentation that we can use to train the network. What we want to predict are the parameters of a geometrical model. So that would be what I call this CIJK here. Now, the first thing we can ask ourselves is there such a thing as a ground truth set of parameter? Well, I can convince you very easily that no, there isn't, because I can generate quite a lot of geometrical models that will very well approximate this set of pixels with different set of parameters. So we can't just, you know, train the model with a ground truth set of parameter or an ideal geometrical model. This just doesn't exist. However, what we are interested in is what this geometrical model represents, as in what this red curve captures in terms of geometry. And so what we really want to use to train our model is not the value of these parameters themselves, but the nature of the curve they generate. And this is something that we can obviously do by saying, okay, with this parameter and the known basis function we're using in this case, we can generate the model and then compare it with the discrete contour that we have. Now, the one thing that is missing is that this is a continuous object, this is a discrete object. So how do we compare them? Well, no big surprise, we can actually sample this model. And here, I mean, it sounds extremely trivial, but there is something very beautiful in this process. It is that because this guy is continuous, we can always sample as many points as we like from this model. So there is no notion of, you know, how many pixels did we have in the first place? Is the object bigger than another object? Our model doesn't care about that. It can always sample as many points as it needs because it can sample an infinite number of them. So based on that, we proposed this method called Splinedist. That is a modification of Stardust, where essentially we use the same kind of unit model. We have to modify a little bit the layers because we want them to fit now this representation, but in terms of the actual network architecture, otherwise it's pretty much the same. We train it with the set of pixel probabilities, as in the classical Stardust case. Now, instead of having these ground truth rays, what we have are just ground truth contour for each object. And what we predict are parameters of the models, the geometrical models that we are predicting for each object, as well as the pixel probabilities. So in terms of loss, the overall loss looks like this. The first part is just binary cross entropy for the pixel classification part. So I guess this is not too surprising. The second part is a contour loss. And this is really exactly what I just described. So here, sorry, here, this is basically just looking at the difference between the ground truth set of points that we have as a reference and the points that we sample from the predicted contour model. So yeah, again, the initial goal of Splinedist was not necessarily to do segmentation. It is to extract geometrical model out of images, but actually it also does segmentation as a byproduct. And the good thing about it is that it doesn't have any assumption on the object model apart from the fact that, you know, it is interpolated in a specific way. So what this means is that it relieves the star convex polygon constraint of Stardust. So it can actually be used as an extension of Stardust, even if you're only interested in the segmentation part. We have code for that. It is currently being used by a bunch of our collaborators. If you have questions or you want to use it yourself, please have a look and get in touch with us if you have any questions. So now we kind of have at least the first idea on how to automate the extraction of geometrical model from images. So the second part that I want to talk about is what do we now do with this geometrical model? So how can we use these representations in order to quantify shape variability and explore shape variability in a collection? And for that, the example that I want to illustrate this with here is this data set of swimming C. elegans worms, where what we wanted to do is to understand how the dynamics of the worm differ. So how they somehow build this swimming dynamic at different age of development. So we can extract geometrical models for each of the worm of each of the frame of the videos that these two videos I showed you, or many other videos. This gives us a collection of little wiggly outlines like that. And now the question is, can we investigate and quantify the variability that there are in these collections and how much one collection differ from another? So what I'm going to talk about now here is joint work with my former colleague Julien Fajot and our student Anna Song. What we got interested in is a technique called sparse dictionary learning. That is actually not something that has to do with shape analysis in the first place. It's a general data analysis technique, and you may have heard or even used this in the past. So effectively, the way that this works is the following. Sorry, we have a data set of k elements that are vectors in RD. What we are trying to retrieve is a dictionary of j elements called atoms that are have the same dimensions as the vector, the input vector themselves, and a collection of scalar weights that, when linearly combined with the dictionary atoms, are able to reconstruct each and every original data vector. So we are minimizing the reconstruction error, as you see here, and there are two important parameters in this algorithm. The first one is j, the number of atoms, so the size of the dictionary. If j is small, much smaller than k, then this is a dimension reduction technique. This is a way to kind of find basis elements that allow us to then reconstruct each and every element in the data set. It may remind you of PCA. There are actually some links to it. It is different. The main difference is through this other parameter n0 that relates to sparse in the name, and that, as you see here, is a condition that says we are allowed to use at most n0 elements in each of the reconstructions. So what this means concretely, sorry, is that if j is small and n0 is smaller than j, like we are doing a lot of compression here, because we are asking to find a dictionary that is small, that is able to explain a large collection of data, but that for each data point uses only a subset of the dictionary for the reconstruction. So this really is a very strong way of kind of decorrelating information and identifying patterns in data set. And one of the important things, and the reason why we got excited about it, is that it doesn't have assumptions on the fact that data maybe have to be normally distributed, unlike PCA. So it works if we have shape distributions that are completely wild, multimodal, and so on and so forth. So this is a complicated problem, but because it's a general data analysis technique, it has attracted quite a lot of attention, and there are good ways to solve this problem. There is one famous toolbox developed by Meral and colleague that solves it. Now, in our case, we want to use that in order to quantify variability in collection of geometrical model, quantify morphological variability, right? So the first thing we have to ask ourselves is, what are input data in our case? Is it really just a vector of parameters of our geometrical model? Well, actually not. And to convince you of this, I have to go back to the founding fathers of shape analysis, David Kendall, that you may know or may not know about. So David Kendall did a lot of work on shape in the 70s and 80s and characterizing mathematically shape and shape analysis. And he proposed this definition of what we now call Candleshape as the information that remains once we have removed similitude transformation, so that is position, scaling, and orientation from a geometrical object. And just to convince you that this really is the right concept, these three leaves here, they are different geometrical models because their parameters are placing them differently in the image. They have different size, they're oriented in different ways. But I think we all agree that in terms of the morphological information they contain, it is exactly the same. And that's what this concept of Candleshape captures. So we denote that with brackets, and essentially these three guys share the same candle shape. So what we want to do is sparse dictionary learning on candle shapes of geometrical models. And so there are a bunch of challenges if we want to do that. The first one is that classically, the space of candle shapes, so the sort of analysis that is carried out on candle shapes is done for objects that are described with discrete set of points that are called landmarks. I'll come back to that in a second. And the second more technical problem is that the space generated by Candleshape objects is actually a nonlinear space. It is a Riemannian manifold. So what this means concretely is that we can't just use the linear formulation I showed you earlier, because we can't do things like, I don't know, adding things together and then, you know, subtracting them, summing them up and so on. We will get out of the space. So we have to give a meaning to this sort of operation and reformulate the problem adapted to the geometry of the Candleshape space. So people have looked at this problem of doing this dictionary learning on manifolds, and essentially the there are two big families of solutions that have been proposed. The first one is to rely on a kernel trick, that is mapping the space onto a Hilbert space, classically a reproducing kernel Hilbert space. This is quite mathematically heavy, so if we can avoid that, that would be good. The second type of solution is to locally linearize the space by projecting it on a tangent plane. And this is something that you may know if you have ever done shape PCA, because that's the classical procedure that is used in shape PCA. Now, the problem with that is that it introduces distortions. So if we were using dictionary learning just as a way to compress or to have a compact representation of our data without looking at the representation themselves, that would be fine. There would be no problem with it. But if we actually want to be able to look at the dictionary atoms and kind of, you know, maybe infer the sort of variability that is present there to make biological hypotheses, distortions are really bad. So we don't want that. So we were not really satisfied with this, plus the fact that all of this does not work with geometrical models. So what we did here is to propose a solution in which we essentially reconstruct the whole Candleshape space in a slightly different ways, in which geometrical models can be included. And we have, as we shall see, a pretty easy solution for that problem. So the first thing we need to consider is what are the differences and similarities between the kind of classical representation that is used to build the Candleshape space and the representation that we want to use. So the classical representation, as I mentioned earlier, is this kind of point cloud representation of landmarks. So that would be a sparse set of points that are placed at striking location on the object. Here that would be a hand. Or representation is this more like continuous outline that just reproduces the whole contour. So they are obviously very different, just from the fact that this is discrete, this is continuous. So in terms of, you know, number of points, if we can talk like that, this is finite, this is infinite. Now, if you remember how we generate these guys, as I explained to you a few slides ago, these are actually built by interpolating a finite set of parameters. So in terms of which amount of information we need to generate this continuous object, this is very, very similar to the amount of information we need to generate this discrete object. And again, it may sound trivial, but this is actually a key observation, because what this means is that, again, if we are in a setting in which we fix the generator, so we know this bit of information, we actually need the same amount of information to construct a discrete object and a continuous object. So taking that into account, what we proposed is to reconstruct Candleshape space in the following way. We will consider our input data as vectors of complex numbers instead of 2D points. And this is completely equivalent to 2D points. So the real part, is the X coordinate, the imaginary part is the Y coordinate. You'll see in a minute why we want to use complex numbers. We can associate to this input data a complex inner product. So that would be something that essentially depends on the nature of the data, whether they are discrete or continuous. If they are discrete point sets, this matrix here is going to be identity. If they are continuously interpolated geometrical model, this is going to be a function of the basis that we are using. And now with this representation, we can very concisely represent all the effect of similitude on a given object. So again, similitude is position, scaling, and orientation. And now, trust me, that with this expression, AZ plus BU, I can actually capture all possible change of position, scale, and orientation of an object Z. And the reason for that is that this number here, A, is a complex number. And as you may know, when we multiply a complex number, what happens is that we have a scaling effect with its modulus and a rotation effect with its phase. So this guy captures scaling and orientation. And all we need to add is the effect of positioning, which is captured by this BU here, where B is again just a complex number and U is a vector that captures a unit shift of our input data in space. So once we have defined that, we can easily also characterize the fact that our input data is centered, that is just when its inner product with U is 0, and normalized, that's when its inner product with itself is 1. And we can build the space, what we call the pre-shape sphere, which is the space of all inputs that have been centered and normalized. So that satisfies these two conditions. And now to build the final Candleshape space, what do we need to do? We just need to still account for orientation effects. And again, because we are now dealing with complex numbers, orientation is fairly easy because any change in orientation is basically just a complex number of modulus 1. So to remove the effect of orientation, we have to quotient out with the group of complex number of modulus 1. So that's our final space. I won't go too much into details, but we can actually show that the structure of this space is inherited from that of the pre-shape sphere, which is a much easier space to work with. So we'll see that in a second. But essentially equipped with that, we can reformulate sparse dictionary learning for 2D Candleshape as follow. So now this is a nonlinear formulation. Our input data are pre-shapes, so input vectors that have been centered and normalized. We learn pre-shapes. We have weights that are complex number. What we minimize is the reconstruction error between the candle shape of the input data and the candle shape of the reconstruction. That's what this bracket means. And we can use different types of distances on the shape space. So as I mentioned earlier, the shape space is a Riemannian manifold. So the first obvious distance that comes to mind is the intrinsic Riemannian distance or the geodesic distance. So this has an expression involving shapes, obviously, but it's also a function of another type of distance, which is the full Procrustes distance. That's the arc distance between 2 points. So that's more like the Euclidean straight line distance that kind of goes out of the shape space. This is also the more intuitive distance that we would obtain, if we were to kind of manually align things onto one another. And here, what we can show, and again, I don't go into detail for time reason, but I encourage you to read the paper if you want to know more about the detail. This is proposition 3.6 in the paper. We can actually show that this particular distance has a closed form expression involving pre-shapes only. So we can actually compute the distance between shapes by sticking to pre-shapes, which are, again, just input data that have been centered and normalized. So this is actually quite good in terms of computation and efficiency. And what this means is that if we use this distance for which we have a closed form expression with pre-shapes, we actually go back to a linear formulation. So we can do sparse dictionary learning on candle shapes that are either point set or geometrical models, relying on a linear formulation with the slight twist that we now have complex numbers everywhere. So in terms of algorithmic details, what we have to do is simply adapt this classical way of solving the dictionary learning problem that I mentioned at the beginning that was developed by Meral and colleagues. It's called the SPAMS toolbox. We have to adapt it to the case of complex number because this is initially formulated for real scalars. If you're interested in the details, concretely what happens is that we alternate between two steps. The first one is a dictionary update. So we fix the weights, we search for the dictionary elements, and this is solved with the method of optimal direction. So that's basically a gradient descent. And another step in which we do sparse coding. So we fix the dictionary, update the weight, and this is done with other recursive matching pursuit. So I actually just noticed that I forgot to put a link here, but we have a Git repo with the code for this algorithm. If you're interested, I invite you to look at the paper for that. And yeah, sorry for forgetting to put it here. And if we finally go back to the worms we started from in the first place, so what did we have? We had these videos of C. elegans worms swimming around. We were interested in understanding how their dynamics is constructed. The first thing we did was to extract geometrical models out of them. And now that we have this dictionary learning technique, we can actually build shape dictionaries out of this C. elegans collection. So now what this tells us is, first of all, okay, that these kind of 5 elements for each of the collection is, kind of the intrinsic shape motifs that are present, but it's even better. It's actually that now we have a level of compression that is quite intense because we can not only throw away the original video, we can also throw away this collection here and just keep for each worm a vector of 5 numbers that just tells us how to combine these elements to reconstruct the outline. And it's actually less than 5 numbers because we have a sparsity of 3 here. So that means 2 of these numbers are going to be 0. The other thing we can do is to actually quantitatively describe the dynamics. And the way this is done is by essentially looking at how the weight vectors evolve over time. So here, these matrices, are color-coded along both axes runs time, and each entry of the matrix tells you how similar the weight vector at the time point given by the row index is to the weight vector at the time point given by the column index. So what we can see here is that essentially the dynamics of this younger worm is constructed by kind of alternating between shapes that are constructed by using different types of atoms in the dictionary, where the older worms have this kind of transition between time period where they reuse the same combination of dictionary atoms over and over again. So again, I mean, at this point, okay, then you would have to still think of, does it mean anything biologically speaking? But at least what's interesting is that it gives us an insight on how this dynamic is really constructed in terms of shape combination and shape motifs. Yeah, so I'm getting to the end of it. So just to sum up what I presented here, you heard about geometrical modeling, you heard about shape analysis, and essentially the reason why we are doing all of that is to hopefully one day be able to have a look at all of these different microscopy images and essentially say, okay, now all of these seemingly very different problems can be analyzed and dealt with using the same sort of framework, which would be to first abstract ourselves from the image format using geometrical modeling, and then use statistical shape analysis tools that use this geometrical modeling representation in order to quantify what's happening and model shape changes and understand, hopefully, biology that is happening in the background. So with that, I have a lot of people to thank. First and foremost, my team for their hard work and constant good mood, our funding agency, our collaborators, you for your attention. I also want to mention that we are recruiting. So if you liked what you just heard and you would want to work around that, please get in touch with me. And with that, I will be happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.
I mean, during the talk was already Mark, so maybe we were sort of forced first.
Sure. So I think in the middle of the talk, I was kind of getting interested in the relationship between interpolating the pixel or voxel space, where we do have some prior information, usually from a microscope, in terms of like the point spread function that that would give us some intuition minus noise about how to interpolate that. And I was wondering how that constrains or interacts with your parameterization, the smoothness of your shape models. And are your shapes generally trying to be smoother than what that would produce from like trying to trace out a, let's say, upsampled version of the voxels, or are you trying to do something simpler than that or smoother than that rather?
Yeah, thank you. This is a really, really good question. So actually, at the moment, we are not. So in most of the what I presented, we are not using like point spread function information or like noise model for the microscope. So this is not something that we have yet in the system. But it's obviously, as you mentioned, something that could be incorporated, in the same way as in the 1D data fitting problem. If you have some prior, what sort of noise is there and like what is the spread of the data, then you could add that as a regularizer in the way that you fit your model. So at the moment, we are not doing that at all. So this really just is based on pixel information. But this is definitely something that, yeah, I think we want to look at in the future because it makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Virginie. Then Tim.
Yeah, hi. First of all, thanks for the nice talk, Virginie. I have one question about this dictionary you're talking about in the end. Would you say it's kind of valid to say that the number of entries, so to say, that you have in the dictionary could be something like an upper limit that you would expect for the number of physical parameters if you try to physically model the dynamics that actually determine the shape of the system?
Yeah, that's again, a really good question. Thank you. So that's, I think, what we want to converge to. This is not the case at the moment, because again, kind of now the way that the problem is formulated, following the classical formulation, it's really just minimizing approximation error, right? And so as such, the number of dictionary atoms is something that you choose. And what you can do, I mean, what we do classically is to monitor how the approximation error decreases with the size of the dictionary. And then, you get at the point where adding just dictionary element doesn't help you get to a better approximation, or just like helps for an epsilon of it, and you can say, okay, that's kind of my minimal amount. However, the way that the dictionary is learned at the moment kind of does not really enforce how to say that easily. So it does not enforce that the different dictionary elements are maximally decorrelated. And what I mean by that is that at the moment, you may very well have dictionary elements that kind of share redundant information, right? And so this is not something, this is something that we want to get rid of. And one of the things that we are working on at the moment, and that I was kind of hoping to be able to present, but it's actually not yet ready, is to change a little bit the problem to have a regularizer that enforces that. So that enforces that we decorrelate the atoms in terms of the shape information that they contain as much as possible. But essentially, yeah, the goal would be to get to exactly what you said, to get to a setting that tells us, okay, here is the absolute minimum you need to understand morphology in this collection. But this is slightly different from the way that dictionary learning is classically formulated. So yeah, we need to work a little bit around how we want to constrain the problem such that it gives us this, and this is work in progress.
Cool, thank you.
Okay, thanks again. Stefan.
Oh, thanks. Thanks, Virginie. This is super interesting. I know you said you can't give a general answer for what a good shape representation would be, but what's your personal preference at this time in the world for 3D shape representations that gives us some tools, for example, to, I don't know, that surfaces don't stupidly intersect or stuff like this, and help avoiding these kind of things?
Yeah, that's hard. Yeah, okay, so I'm going to answer that in 2 steps. So there is like, what is my favorite shape representation, and then what is a convenient shape representation, because this may not be the same. So I think what I'm personally most interested in, and I kind of briefly touched upon this when I started talking about geometrical modeling, what I'm very interested in is how the very construction of this geometrical model can help inform the shape complexity, as in, if we go towards this minimal model, so, you know, trying to find what is the sort of best basis parameter set combination to represent the shape with the least amount of bits, essentially. I think this can tell something about how the morphology is constructed, and per se, it can be an interesting readout to just compare different objects, right? So that's what I would like to get to, just because it's interesting from a, yeah, from a conceptual point of view. Now, in terms of, yeah, what is the most convenient for 3D at the moment? Honestly, I think it's, yeah, the good old meshes are still the thing that works the best, right? Because and this is just because we don't have a good way still to constrain these more flexible models, right? Because again, the kind of dream would be to say, okay, you don't need a mesh with a lot of points, you can have something much sparser, and it interpolates very well in between, and so on and so forth. But like fitting this at the moment is a mess, and it cannot be done really at scale and reliably. So yeah, I hope we'll get there, but there is work to do.
Thanks.
Okay, I don't see another, but I have 2 questions actually. I mean, probably you said it, but so these atoms that you get, do you sort of like how unique? Can you say that they are unique? Let's say you get 5 atoms. Could there be also 5 other atoms that look completely different, but are almost as good, or how is that?
Yeah, so at the moment this is possible. Yeah, at the moment this is possible because there is no, I mean, yeah, there is no real constraint to say that the atoms must be well decorrelated. So it's very possible that, you know, you get different sort of mix and match of shape features that produce different set of atoms, and that when put together recreate the same space. So there is a, I mean, at the moment this is not very, very clean, but this is something that we can enforce by turning this set of atom into a basis. So making sure that this is kind of the unique set that maximally decorrelates the information, and that's, yeah, that's something we're doing and looking at the moment.
Okay. Then the other thing with this Splinedist thing,
yeah.
Like, so is the number of parameters per object, is that also learned, or do you fix that?
No, so at the moment this is fixed. We have a prototype where it is learned. and yeah, again, it's not as robust as it could be at the moment, but at least in 2D, we have very good reasons to believe that yeah, this will work reliably soon, right? So then the next step would be 3D, and that boils down to Stefan's question. Once we have that in 3D, then yeah, the real fun starts. But there is a bit of work to be done before that.
Okay, cool. Mark, you still have your hand from before, I guess, or you have another question? Okay. Stefan,
I just didn't lower my hand. So.
No problem.
I have another question.
Ah, okay, go ahead.
Okay, so, and I'll put my hand down now. I just wanted to wait if somebody else wants to ask something. So one of the things that bugs me with these shape representations is usually what I mentioned before, that, for example, when you build a spline, you have no control over where things intersect, like completely illogically, right? Because in spline space, this is perfectly legal, and everything. And the same is true for meshes. And so that they're not really nice for this, and this is just so crazy when you think about biological objects or physical objects in the real world, that it feels very wrong to or I don't know, it intuitively feels wrong to look for sparse representations in this kind of realm where seemingly impossible things are so easy and so cheap compared to what we actually know about stuff. So I was wondering, so what do you think about like more classical or simple things? Like so for example, if I have a 3D or ND space, I can describe almost every shape with voxels or pixels, right? And they don't have this problem because it can be either on or off, and there are no intersections of pixels because they describe a grid. And I can compress these pixels into multi-scale representations, such as sparse octrees or stuff like this. But I haven't seen, or I don't know of anything about to do shape analysis or some structural comparison on top of these things. Does that make sense to look into this, or do you think that it is actually better to look at these smoother vectographic style representation?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I'm obviously partial on that because I really like the vector graphics representation. But okay, so I would say my argument for using this sort of representation is that, again, if you think of, at least as far as I'm concerned, if I think of like how is shape defined in terms of what kind of type of feature this is purely geometrical, right, in a sense. And as such, my intuition would be, okay, so we need a structure that is something built out of geometry, and that actually describes geometry. And this is not the case of sets of pixels in multi-scale representation. So that would be that is my intuition for believing in this other type of representation for shape and for this very specific context of shape analysis. However, and yeah, that's something that I forgot to mention earlier. I mean, you certainly know this sort of spline-based models and so on. The classical way to feed them is like in this active contour type of algorithms, and like in that framework, what is very successful in the medical world, at least, is to use shape prior that are based on pixel information and maybe pixel pyramid constructions and so on. So shape information that would essentially say, okay, the pixels don't necessarily allow me to characterize or describe the shape feature, but they can somehow explain me how these shape features are constructed, and this can be used to constrain the model that I fit to then characterize the shape, if that makes sense. And again, in the world of medical imaging, this is easier because we can build atlases, and a pancreas can only look so much, deviate so much from a pancreas and so on. And this is not necessarily the case for cells. So we have to think of how we can exploit this sort of idea in microscopy. But I still believe that if what we want to do is really just explore the construction of shape, I think this is the right type of representation, just because that's the right object to work with if we want to do geometry, right? But yeah. And again, like, yeah, as usual, there are I mean, in the end, it's probably going to be a mix of many things that allows us to get to what we want to get to, right? So I'm not claiming this is the one and only approach that will that will overpower everything else. I just think that this is a valuable angle.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks again. Then maybe Jean-Karim, last question for today.
Yeah. Thanks, Virginie. I think I'm quite sold on the sparse dictionary learning now that I see how it is. But I would still introduce my favorite shape description via topological data analysis, and especially for the 3D case, I kind of have the intuition that you could approach or constrain the problem, for example, by constraining the shape modeling to some topological space that approximates. So you a little bit like what UMAP is doing, where they're looking at the closest Riemannian space that locally approximate the topology of the data. And I'm just wondering, or I kind of think that this could be used also for constraining basically the model in 3D. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I think, and I mean, again, I think this is a really that's a really good point, and this is definitely a very natural direction to go. Exactly as you said, to constrain the model, but also to constrain the sort of the sort of feature that are being learned, for instance, in the different atoms. So yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense to include topological information as a prior in all of these different settings. This is not something that we have explored yet, but again, I think this is exactly the place we are going. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thanks Virginie again, and everybody for the good questions and the nice discussion. And yeah, I don't know, Rikke, you want to say something, or should we just...
So maybe first of all, thank you very much, Virginie. That was a great presentation. That was very insightful, like really like a different take on image analysis. I like the deep dive, actually. Thank you very much. We had scheduled for July, on July 6th, the talk of Chen Wang from Janilia, but this talk is right now postponed until January, so a little bit later, but January 2022. But therefore, we will actually have two presentations actually in July, more about ImageJ. But you will get more information about that. And there I have to thank Christian for taking over the initiative, contacting people, and so on and so forth. And these presentations will be given two at the same time on July 20th. So that's really something to look forward to. And I hope you all join as well. But with that, thank you very much again, Virginie, and everyone else also for joining, asking questions. And see you then in July, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you all for the questions. Thank you.